And we're all going to be trying today to nourish those green shoots and to invite your support in doing that. In today's session, we have some celebration to do and also some very serious, potentially life-saving reflection to do. The celebration is for the publication of the book Bite Back, People Taking on Corporate Food and Winning. This book was published last week by the University of California Press. It was edited by Saru Jayaraman and Catherine DeMaster, with a foreword by Marian Nessel. Our panelists today are contributors to this book. I'm reading this book now, and I can encourage you all to get and read the book. Of course, the book was written before the COVID epidemic, but its goal to learn from the accomplishments and limitations of the food movement that has unfolded over the last decade or so and has sought to disrupt corporate power in the food system could not be more timely. So congratulations and thank you to the editors and authors and our panelists today. And that gets to the second serious part of our session today. In our lifetime, we have seen several turning points. The emergence of the civil rights, environmental, women and gay rights and lesbian movements of the 1960s and 70s, the war in Vietnam and the global resistance to it, the rise of a determined alliance between social conservatives and corporate America in the 1980s and beyond, and of course the 2008 global financial crisis, and the recognition that climate change was threatening the future of humanity and the planet. In retrospect, these turning points constituted the test of each generation. Would people be able to confront challenges to well-being, social justice, racial and other forms of equity, and even to survival? Or would powerful elites be able to use the crisis to further consolidate their power and their capacity to shape the world to their needs? I fear we're all recognizing that the COVID epidemic represents another such turning point. For those of us alive and acting in the world today, this is our test. And some of the questions that COVID forces us to confront are the same questions that came up in prior crises. How do we find the right mix of incremental change and achievable victories, but also to insist on transformative changes? How can we bring people together to make real changes today and tomorrow, but also insist that deeper changes are needed in our economic and political system that is so often unfair, damaging to well-being, and stacked against the majority of the world's people? How do we choose the right mix of strategies that brings new individuals and constituencies into our campaigns, but also enable the most dedicated to stay with us and not feel sold out? And how do we develop leaders who can both speak for the constituencies they represent, but also build bridges to other constituencies so we can be more powerful tomorrow than we are today? In our session today, our speakers will be using their experiences as leaders, activists, organizers, and critics of the food movement to suggest lessons that might help us move through the crises that the COVID epidemic and the government and corporate responses to it are generating. And I'm going to be introducing each of our speakers, and they will then talk for about 10 minutes. We'll have a little bit of time for questions, and when the four have finished, we'll turn it over to you and ask you through the chat function to ask questions which we'll pose to the speakers. Our first speaker is Saru Jayaraman, who is the president of One Fair Wage and the director of the Food Labor Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. Saru, in your chapter in Bite Back, you describe food workers as the face that has been most successful in pushing back against the Goliath of corporate power in the US global food system. What do you think have been some of the accomplishments of food workers in resisting corporate control? And what lessons can we learn to shape the food movement's response to the COVID epidemic?
Thanks, Nick. Thank you for organizing this panel, and thank you to Jose, Chris, and Andy, who are part of our book, and for being with us this morning, 3 of us very morning. And to everybody who's participating around the country. We're really happy to have this conversation with you. And I'm sorry that I can't stay the whole time, but I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation nevertheless. You know, before coronavirus, before COVID-19 happened, I think there was a lot that the broader efforts around reform and transformation in the food system could learn from food workers who fought for really transformation of their lives and their system. And the main thing that we hope the book gets across, that we hope can be learned from the successes of workers in the food movement, food worker movement, is fundamentally just the power of organizing. And, you know, people use that word organizing so loosely, so broadly in many different ways. People say they're doing organizing, and obviously every right to call whatever they're doing, whatever they want to call it. But we have a very specific definition that we're referring to in the book that talks about why workers have had success in going up against corporate power. And this is the definition of organizing that we use, that I use in my classes when I teach social movements in UC Berkeley. That's used broadly among lots of people who do community and worker organizing. Organizing is, number one, it's 4 things: collective power, led by those most affected. So not the professional organizers, not the professional activists, not the nonprofit workers, but by the people most affected, to engage in direct action, targeting those in power to make concrete improvements in people's lives. And that third one, I think, is something that sometimes is missing from other efforts at reform or transformation of the food system. I mean, there's a lot that, you know, we can learn from. Certainly collective action led by those most impacted. So in the case of food workers, that's workers themselves. But I would say in every aspect of the food system, that's generally people that social movement scholars would call people with limited means. People with limited means gathering together and taking on direct action. That means targeting, often face-to-face. In COVID, we've had to do direct actions that are not face-to-face. Sometimes in our cars, we do direct action. People are doing direct action lots of creative ways in this moment. But prior to coronavirus, direct action meant you are actually going to the place of power. You are actually going to the corporate headquarters, or to the legislators' offices, or to, City Hall. And you're not lobbying, you're not asking for something, you're demanding something collectively. You are engaging in what some social movement scholars call contentious behavior. You are contending for power. The goal of organizing is not to just ask for something, ask for a reform, plead for a policy change. It is to contend for power. Who has power? Is it the people or is it the corporations? Is it the people or the legislators they elected who supposedly serve them? That's the question of organizing. And that is the work that workers have been doing in the food system for a long time. And that we want to encourage the other aspects of the food system to think about and take on. And we do provide examples in the book of people engaging and organizing in other aspects around fracking, around public health, around hunger issues. We do provide examples of people organizing outside of labor issues. But I do want to say that it is in the labor section of the broad food, spectrum around food issues. It is in the labor section that we've seen the most organizing, the most contentious behavior, the most collective action by people with limited means taking on those in power, and thus the most success. I love some of these comments. In our case, that has been a wonderful, there's been a wonderful moment to look at how you can turn crisis into opportunity. There have been wonderful moments like this. And I don't mean wonderful in the sense of great, because crisis is often quite painful. It is very painful right now. I mean wonderful in the sense of extraordinary. that there are extraordinary moments of opportunity that arise from crisis. So organization, the Restaurant Opportunity Center, started after 9/11. On 9/11, there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower 1, called Windows on the World. And on that morning in New York City, 73 workers died. And 250 workers lost their jobs in the World Trade Center, and about 13,000 restaurant workers lost their jobs citywide. And so I was asked at the time to start a relief center in the aftermath of the tragedy for workers who had lost their jobs. Initially, we were handing out checks to workers. It was a somewhat comparable moment for those that were around in New York City at the time. It was a somewhat comparable moment to this moment in that lots of people were out of work. People had died. There was extreme pain and trauma. And yet there was a feeling among workers that we needed to see change. And it was out of the ashes of that tragedy that we created the Restaurant Opportunity Center, and we grew it into a national organization of workers all over the country fighting for change. And we took on large restaurant corporations and won. We took Trump and won. In 2017, Trump tried to make tips the property of owners, and we organized, tips the property of owners, make tips the property of owners. And we organized 400,000 people to fight that, and we won. We made property of workers now and forever. So we've gone up against some very powerful forces through organizing and won. And it is that similar kind of idea or moment that we find ourselves in right now. Obviously, coronavirus is a horrible moment of crisis for millions of people around the world. In the restaurant sector, we've seen close to 10 million workers lose their jobs. They are devastated. Most of them actually don't have access to employment insurance. It's not actually just about immigration issues. That's a huge part of the problem, and very, very unconscionable to have millions of workers not able to access unemployment insurance because of their status. But even beyond that, we're seeing a majority of non-immigrants unable to access unemployment insurance because they've earned a wage of $2 an hour, the federal minimum wage for tipped workers, because of the power of a horrible corporate trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association, which runs chains, which has fought to keep the wage at $2.13 an hour over an 80-year period since the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed. And this is the kind of corporate power that we must directly confront. Coming up back again to the definition of organizing. If you see that a corporation like Applebee's and IHOP and the likes have formed this trade lobby and have fought for 80 years to keep the wages at $2.13 an hour, reform really isn't an option. What is the only thing on the table is to organize people to contend against the National Restaurant Association and the legislators that wrote to the National Restaurant Association and say enough is enough. We cannot be earning $2 and $3. And we had been having that fight for the last decade. When coronavirus really stripped that system, never ever worked in the first place, because now you've got 10 million workers, most of them are ineligible, and we are hearing from millions of them that they're ineligible because their wages are so low with tips that even with tips, they're not meeting the minimum threshold that qualifies them to get unemployment insurance. The minimum threshold that a state considers that you are working. So we're hearing from millions of waitresses across the country. 70% of tipped workers are women, single moms saying, I don't know how I'm going to feed my kids. I worked full time in 1 or 2 restaurants, and the state is saying I didn't earn enough to qualify for unemployment insurance. So it is that crisis that has created opportunity. We created a fund for these workers. We raised $13 million. We have 100 applicants to the fund. And not only have we been getting out cash relief, but we've been organizing those workers into massive teletown halls and virtual rallies. We did one with AOC last week and another with Senator Kamala Harris and Pramila Jayapal. We've done them with state legislators. And on these rallies and town halls, workers are saying, like, we should not go back to work until we are actually paid a livable wage. Workers are saying things like unemployment insurance should be universal and measured on $15 plus tips, which is what we should have gotten in the first place. And believe employers, many of them who didn't agree with us in the past, are waking up to the fact that this system never worked in the first place. So we're now able to grow our allies with small businesses that actually are seeing that this was an untenable system to begin with. And so I say these things because we have now seen twice, after 9/11 and now after Trump's election, and again, that organizing is the way that we win. Organizing is the way that we take on collectively, we take on the corporate powers that control our democracy, our economy, our lives. And three, that when you engage in actual organizing, when you engage in contentious behavior, collective power, led by those most impacted, those with limited means, taking on through direction those who control our lives, those with power, those corporate powers, and demanding change. When you do those things, you can win. It is hard, it is scary, it takes a lot of effort. It takes moving people who are afraid or may not want to engage in these ways, but it is the only way that we have throughout global history to achieve true change. And it is that reason that we are really trying through the book to encourage examples and of organizing happening in lots of different segments of the food system, and also trying to train people, trying to provide examples and ultimate training. We, through my center at UC Berkeley, are hoping to offer the food system broadly training and organizing, so we can all learn how to use these basic skills to transform issues of food, whether it's access to healthy food, or it's public health issues, or it's animal rights, or it's the environment, or it's hunger issues, or it's seeds and pesticides. It is organizing can help us, can't help us, is the pathway to allow us to take on corporate power and win. I do just want to say one more thing. In moments like this of extraordinary crisis, when the structural inequities of our system are stripped bare and are revealed, that is the most important moment to step in and demand change. So there's a wide coalition of us that are working under the banner of There Is No Going Back, demanding that we all engage in thinking, imagining what we want to see when we reopen, that we're not going back. Never worked. Monsanto having control of our seeds never worked. Big corporations ruining our health never worked. None of these things worked. And this is the moment we're saying to reimagine before we reopen. Reimagine before what a new system will look like. The only way we're going to get that new system is through organizing. Thanks. Nick, I think you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Saru. That was just a very inspiring talk. And I know you need to leave, so I wanted to ask you one question maybe before you go. And I wonder what you could say to food activists who are working, in addition to signing up for your course on organizing that you're offering. What do you think are some ways that food activists who are not currently working with labor can begin to develop those relationships, and particularly ways that are being opened up by the COVID epidemic with its new attention to food workers and its devastating impact on food workers?
And demand a whole new food system. I think so much of our work across the food system, whether it's organizing or not, has been uplifted. The fact that food workers are essential, I mean, just those words have transformed our ability to say, well, if they're essential, why are they being paid $2 an hour? If they're essential, why have they never received the paid sick leave and the health care that they've needed all along? That's part of it, but also hunger. I'm sure Andy's going to talk about this, but the massive amounts of need to feed people in equitable ways, and to do it in ways that don't just provide immediate relief, but create structural reform, are really, really prescient now, are really, really present, the opportunities to work together. So I'm just going to give one quick example. So we had been hearing, we started to hear over the last couple of weeks from employers who said, you know, we didn't agree with you. We didn't think we could ever pay more than $2 an hour, but we're seeing now that this system is broken and it didn't work, and we're willing to consider change. But we're devastated. You know, most small businesses are considering, am I going to reopen at all? Will I ever come back, in terms of at least restaurants, but I know other food businesses as well. And so we've joined forces with small businesses, small restaurants that have independent, basically not, that are saying we're open to change post-COVID. And we've created a public-private partnership where we've gotten funding for restaurants that are willing to commit to a livable wage next year and greater equity next year. If they commit to that change, they get public and private funding to rehire workers and repurpose themselves as community kitchens, feeding employed people and others in need. And now suddenly we, on the labor side, are working with them, and we're working with food delivery systems, you know, hunger systems, to actually deliver food in a way that also creates quality jobs and employment. But that's just an example of how different segments of the food system came together in a conversation. One of the first people I reached out to this was Andy, who spent his life thinking about hunger issues, but other people as well. And so we've been able to come together in some ways, in small ways, to think about how can we think about relief in a way that structures change. And that's what I would encourage, you know, and I do want to say, through our center, we are creating lots of opportunities for people to come together and think about structural change together, think about organizing together, think about how we can use this moment of crisis for change, for long-term change. And I would be happy to engage with anybody that's thinking about in those ways, even if it's not in labor, if it's in other segments of the food system, because like Andy and I working together, it's very clear that people can come to think together about how to bring these systems together, as long as we're willing to engage in contentious activity.
Great, thank you so much. And we at the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute are very looking forward to exploring with you some ways that we can take our two coasts and see how we can align during this period. Our next speaker is Jose Oliva, who is the campaign director for Heal Food Alliance and the co-founder of the Food Chain Workers Alliance. Jose, you too have been organizing food workers for a long time, and you've also worked as a food worker, giving you firsthand experience. What have you learned both from your life experience and your work experience, and what lessons do you see for the food movement and how we can best respond to the COVID epidemic and the many crises it has precipitated?
That's an excellent question, Nick, and thank you, first of all, for inviting myself to speak here today. I want to answer the question and also follow up on some of Saru's points on the connection between workers' rights, the food movement organizing, and immigration, actually. But I'm going to try not to mansplain the issues. I'm going to try instead to tell you my story, and through that story, hopefully, I'll get to the answer of your question. It's not really a unique story. It's the story of millions of economic or food refugees from Latin America. And I want to start a couple of generations ago with a young economist, that's my grandfather, who grew up and got caught up in this post-World War II idealism. He joined with students and workers and women and civil society organizations to establish the first democracy in Guatemala in 1944. In 1950, he became the agriculture minister. Then, after 10 short years of democracy in 54, a coup that was sponsored by the CIA overthrows the fledgling republic. And the coup, this is the important part, the connection to both foreign policy and food policy, is that the coup happened at the bequest of the United Fruit Company, which is today known as Chiquita, because a new agrarian program was giving land to landless peasants. And so Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA at the time, was the brother of John Foster Dulles, who was the CEO of the United Fruit Company. So the coup happens, my grandfather, disillusioned and angry, moves his entire family to Shela, which is a small highland town. That's where my mother is born. She's taught about the aborted agrarian reform and the frustrated dream overall of democracy. And also that the coup triggered a long, bloody civil war in the context of the Cold War, right? So anyone who opposed the regime was branded a communist. In the course of the 36 years that this war took place, over 200,000 people are murdered, over 1 million people are displaced as refugees, and my family is amongst those refugees. So we came to the United States, my mother and I and my father and my brother, after my mother was threatened. Several of my family members were tortured, killed, including my aunt, my mother's sister, who was mistaken for her. We came to the US. It wasn't easy actually to get here. There was no official refugee status for people fleeing or the consequences or the causes. We were undocumented here for almost 20 years. And my mother, after being a teacher back in Guatemala her entire life, ended up, like many immigrants, working in the restaurant industry. There she worked hard for measly wages and was constantly sexually harassed. Saru can attest to the way that the restaurant industry operates vis-a-vis women. And then when I graduated high school, I wanted to go to college and realized that as an undocumented immigrant, I couldn't access any scholarships or grants or anything. I started to work in the restaurant industry. And I paid for my credit hours as I went. Finally, after graduating from college, I ended up working in the restaurant industry. And in the restaurant industry, I started to see all of these issues that we just finished exploring firsthand, right? That sexual harassment is rampant for women. It really is not an industry. It's sort of the first gig economy industry, right? It's a place where oftentimes you get paid under the table. It's a place where you are often divided between front of the house and back of the house, between English-speaking workers and non-English speaking workers, between white workers and non-white workers, and so forth and so on. So in the context of all of that, I decided that I needed to organize with my coworkers and brought together a group of not just my coworkers, but also folks from the community, several pastors and other religious leaders that decided to accompany us in this fight to improve our working conditions. And we marched in on the boss, very much the process that Saru just described, right? Direct action on the boss with community members accompanying us. And that triggered a process where we ended up negotiating better working conditions, better wages for everybody in that restaurant. And at that point, I thought I had invented a whole new model of organizing, but really it was just a process that actually Rock had been doing for years in New York. It just hadn't made it all the way to Chicago yet. And that gave me this sense that we were connected, that there was a lot of folks doing very similar things to improve working conditions and wages for workers all over the food system. I started to work with Saru to help build Rock at a national level. And through that, started to connect with other food worker organizations and eventually launched the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which is a national network of food worker organizations representing over 370,000 workers in the food system. and through the Food Chain Workers Alliance, eventually realizing exactly what Saru just said, right? That in the food movement overall, we need a stronger organizing tradition. And that organizing tradition in the old African proverb has to be by us, because if it is not by us, it's not for us, right? And so we launched the Heal Food Alliance, which, as you said, Nick, is a national coalition of not just food worker organizations, but eaters and environmental organizations and health organizations and so forth and so on. HEAL itself stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor. And the last thing I want to say is that through COVID, one of the things that we have realized is that this really is unmasking a lot of the inequities, a lot of the injustices that the food system has for many, many years perpetuated, right? And we all know that the roots of the food system are actually in slavery here. The first food workers in this country were slaves. And the owners of those plantations continue to be the owners of this food system that we're currently living in. And so what we have realized, though, is that because there is a need to feed people on the front lines today, right? The COVID-19 crisis has made that very, very obvious, that's an opportunity to bring all of those folks who are unemployed to be employed at training folks to grow their own food. It's an opportunity to get all of those small businesses who are sitting idle today money so that we can use their assets like trucks, restaurants, industrial freezers and so forth, so that we're transporting that food that we're growing to the places that need it the most, all the while employing the millions of folks who are currently unemployed. So this is an opportunity, and I think we have to be very strategic and clear about how to implement that vision. But this is an opportunity to create the infrastructure for that food system that we all want. And I know that that doesn't dismantle the old food system. There has to be a parallel effort to oppose the stranglehold that the large corporations have currently on our food system. But creating that new food system is not just about creating a model and an opportunity and a sort of an exercise of an example, but it's also the way to employ millions of people who are currently unemployed. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I have one follow-up question for you. I wonder if you can say something about how you think the frontline food workers that you've worked with, that the Food Chain Workers Alliance represents, can build alliances with the mainstream national labor unions, and what opportunities does the COVID epidemic present for building and strengthening such alliances?
Yeah, that's another excellent question, Nick. I think a lot of food workers that Food Chain Workers Alliance represents currently are bringing their own traditions from their home countries on what organizing is. A lot of those traditions are rooted in popular education. They're rooted in different ways of thinking about how to build power. They're not different than what Saru described. The ultimate goal is to build power and to have power, but they're doing it in a very different way. And so I do think that unions have a lot to learn in that from those models of organizing. And vice versa, right? I do think that we have in this country a long tradition of labor union organizing. You know, Chicago is home of the Haymarket event, and a lot of folks who come to Chicago from other countries don't know that, and they don't know that this is where the international workers movement began, right, in 1886. And so having those two synergize, right, and become something unique to this country, like many of the other experiments in this country, I think is something that most major labor unions can learn from. And then the flip side of that is that a lot of workers are in a position, especially right now because of COVID-19, where they want to organize. They have been clamoring for it. And if unions don't pounce on that, if we're not prepared to actually make those workplaces collective bargaining places, then we're going to miss a huge opportunity to sort of rebuild the labor movement from the ground up.
Great, thanks. And thanks for your talk and your work. Our next speaker is Andy Fisher, who is the Executive Director of the Ecological Farming Association and author of Big Hunger, a 2017 book published by MIT Press that he came and spoke about at the Urban Food Policy Institute a while ago. Andy, you've been working with and criticizing food banks and the emergency food system for many years. In your opinion, what can and should food banks be doing differently in the time of COVID?
Thank you. Thanks, Nick, for having me here. And it's an honor to be on this panel with Saru and Jose, who are just amazing organizers. And I really appreciate being an author in this book as well. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on now with COVID-19. So I guess let's start in a different place. If I can switch, next slide, please. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, normal wasn't so great for the working poor in America. Next slide. There's been a 10-year recovery, and we find that food insecurity is still at about the same level as it was in 1995. About 1 out of 8 Americans are considered food insecure. The minimum wage has stagnated at 7.25 in 21 states. Low wages, unstable schedules, soaring rents, all lead up to a precarious situation for economic situation for tens of millions of Americans. Next slide. And the state of affairs has been so economically unsustainable that food banks doubled their distribution from 2009 to 2019. It's now they now serve over about 5.5 billion pounds of food to about 40 million people. So fast forward now to 2020, we've got 22 million people who are thrown out of work in just a few short weeks. And the administration really doesn't have much empathy for their plight, nor is it providing much cash for them to keep their refrigerators stocked. So what has happened is that food banks have stepped in to fill that void left by an absentee government. And this time, however, in contrast to the past, is that food banks have gained much more visibility. They're not just the safety net under the safety net. They've become much more as a frontline response. And next slide. So what we see in the press are miles long lines of motorists waiting for a few sacks of groceries. And if we can go to the next slide too, that'd be great. Waiting for a few sacks of groceries, and that's become seared into the public imagination as this kind of meme of isolation and powerlessness that many of us feel in the hands of an incompetent government. So charities become the governing metaphor of the pandemic response. It's replacing justice, which itself is now on a ventilator. But the food to feed these people, the doubling of demand that food banks have seen, that food has to come from somewhere, and that money to buy that food has to come from somewhere. And just as it's done for the past few decades, there's been an alliance between anti-hunger groups, between USDA and corporate America, what I call the hunger industrial complex. And that is providing that money and that food. And it's that paradigm that's filling a vacuum that's left by Trump's sociopathy. James Bailey, who's a professor at George Washington University, talks about, next slide, every crisis creates a void, and whatever force fills that void inherits power. And we should all be concerned that in the post-pandemic era, the hunger industrial complex is going to become even stronger at the expense of the movement for fair wages, strong nutrition programs, and universal health care. We should be concerned about the growth of charity because, frankly, the unholy alliance between food banks and corporate America has shown itself more interested in maintaining the problem than actually solving the problem. Hunger is good for business. So when I was, next slide, please. When I was doing research for my book, Big Hunger, which, as Nick said, came out in 2017, I talked to numerous food banks, and I looked at websites of all of them, and I found that there were very few food banks that were willing to advocate. And can you click on the there you go, thank you. I found that very few food banks were willing to advocate for upstream policies, or willing to advocate for higher minimum wages or universal health care, affordable housing, any kind of anti-poverty policies that would reduce the number of people coming to the food bank in the first place. But the reason why they didn't do that is because those policies would reduce the profitability of the grocery industry, many of whom food banks rely on. Food banks rely on the grocery industry for board members, for technical assistance, for food and cash. They would alienate that core constituency. And I found, as the slide shows, I found that about 22% of board members at food banks worked for a Fortune 1000 company or equivalent. And of those 2,500 board members, only 2 worked for a labor union. And these are that list shows the number of the companies with the highest number of their employees on food bank boards. So this unholy alliance really poses this fundamental question of why on hunger when anti-hunger work is so profitable to all parties. So what corporations get out of anti-hunger work is they get to reduce their labor costs. They get to push their employees onto SNAP or into food banks. They get to reduce their garbage disposal fees. They get reduced tax bills. And most importantly, they get to build their reputations as socially responsible firms. It's kind of like the medieval practices of indulgences, in which the church would sell indulgences, would sell essentially a pass into heaven to the rich. Similarly, what we're seeing is that these donations are whitewashing corporations' hunger-causing practices to make them appear like they're hunger fighters. So that's corporate America. For food banks, hard times are good times. I'm being a little bit cynical here, but their fundraising soars during recessions. And all too often, when they measure their success in the number of pounds that they distribute, the more pounds that they're pushing through the system as they are now, the more they appear to be successful. It's easier for them to appeal for donations. And the larger they are, the easier it is for them to justify the salaries that some of their executives make, which in some cases are north of $500,000. So during this COVID crisis, Big Food and Ag are doubling down on the hunger industrial complex as a way to enhance their reputation. I'll give you 3 examples. Next slide, please. Actually, the one after that, sorry. Okay, so Smithfield. Smithfield is the nation's largest pork producer. It recently donated another $3 million and 10 million pounds of protein to food banks in the wake of the pandemic. And it's been doing this program for a long time, helping hungry homes in which they donate pork to a specific food bank and get a lot of press out of it. But Smithfield has also been sued successfully multiple times for its environmentally racist practices of citing its hog farms, which are highly toxic, next to impoverished African-American communities. And similarly, more recently, they've come under fire for propagating the pandemic at their Sioux Falls, South Dakota processing plant, where over 500 workers have fallen ill with COVID. Next slide, please. At Amazon, the CEO and the world's richest man, Jeff Bezos, recently donated $100 million to Feeding America, which is the nation's food bank trade association. At the same time, Amazon is poised to be one of the 2 redeemers of online SNAP, of online food stamps in a pilot program that's being done in about 8 states around the country, which is a very lucrative position for them. And they've also been revealed to be the largest employer of SNAP recipients in multiple states. So they're paying their workers so low that those workers are recurring to SNAP to make ends meet. Next slide. The same thing is happening over at Walmart. Walmart is the only other national retailer that's allowed to sell groceries to SNAP recipients. Walmart is also famously known for its low wages and for pushing its workers onto SNAP and going to food banks. This is a slide from analysis I did in 2017 from a report from a public policy group in Ohio, which shows that about 13.5% of Walmart employees in Ohio receive SNAP. So if you extrapolate that, we're talking about 200,000 Walmart employees nationally who are potentially receiving SNAP, which is costing the taxpayers $600 million to subsidize the profits just in that one program. So, Walmart also recently threw another $10 million into the food bank pandemic pot. And it certainly captured its tax donation, its tax deduction, and got a lot of good press for that. But it's not just, individual corporations that are donating money and food. USDA has recently committed increasing amounts of cash and commodities to food banks. In the past few years, they put out about $5 billion they bought about $5 billion worth of food through what's called tariff mitigation program to support farmers that were hurt by Trump. And they've recently, in 3 different instances in the past month or so, they've committed to providing about $4 billion worth of food to food banks. And much of that money is being contracted to agribusinesses, such as Del Monte and Tyson, who are the 2 largest vendors in the USDA foods program. So, so kind of just to wrap this up a little bit, it's, for me, I'm odd, I'm odd. I have a lot of friends and colleagues in the food banking community who are working, at 100 miles an hour. And it's odd to see the logistics of this. It's odd to see the scale of this humanitarian endeavor. And I'm also, incredibly appreciative of the community spirit that's come out in terms of the donations of cash and food and volunteer time that are fueling these efforts. But at the same time, I still feel compelled to ask, just like that quote I left at the beginning from Archbishop Helder, about what are the causes of those inequities that are fueling this massive demand, and what are the implications for the future of eliminating hunger in America? Already we're seeing some food banks retrenching. We're seeing them eliminating their social justice programs so they can mobilize all hands on deck to be feeding the lines of people. So as Saru said, going back to the old normal is not a tenable choice at all. The hunger industrial complex needs to be diminished in favor of a stronger government response, one that guarantees living wages, one that guarantees a strong safety net, universal health care, and a whole slew of other public policies that guarantee a living, that guarantee that everyone has a decent living. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And I also have a follow-up question for you. You have been writing and talking about the limits of a charitable response to hunger and food insecurity, as has our Institute co-founder and also activist scholar Jan Poppendiek, who's a senior faculty fellow. And often those of us working in food security suggest as a counterpoint making changes in the public programs like SNAP and WIC and school food. And I wonder if you could say a little, what do you think are the opportunities for changing SNAP, WIC, and school food during this COVID crisis? What are some changes that would move it in a good direction, that would make it not only corporate welfare, but really opening up to a different way of thinking of the public sector and food?
I mean, that's a great question. And there's been, if I can flip that back a little bit. The U.S., in part of this $3 billion rollout that USDA is doing now in terms of buying local food, they're looking at reviving a dead idea, what I call kind of a zombie idea. It's the harvest box that they were trying to replace SNAP with, this kind of old school box of groceries that they would provide to people. They are now contracting out to food hubs and to farmers and to other food businesses to provide those harvest boxes, not to SNAP recipients per se, but through food banks. I mean, this is a $3 billion pilot program for them to roll out this program. So that needs to be nipped in the bud and stopped. And that program could go no further. But I mean, I think what we're seeing otherwise in terms of positive changes is, there's some movement around cashing out SNAP, what's called pandemics, cashing out the school lunch program, since kids aren't going to school now. that they're still in the need of, they're not getting their school meals and their school breakfast. So some states are implementing what's called pandemic SNAP, in which are increasing the value of their SNAP benefits or giving people SNAP cards. So they essentially get that cash value along those lines, which is a fantastic idea. But I also think, there needs to be greater focus on farmers markets. There needs to be greater focus on local food, on ways for the SNAP program and the WIC program. And when we get back to school, as has been the case, is to increase those efforts, because what we've seen is this increased interest in local food system as an example of much more resilience in the food system. We've seen the food supply chain have its problems, and people are increasing their purchases of CSAs and the like, because they're much more interested in that approach. So I think the government needs to follow suit and explore ways to mobilize more federal support for local food systems through those nutrition programs.
Great, thank you. Our fourth and final speaker, and just to remind you, we'll open up the chat line again after the next speaker and give you a chance to write us questions. And it's just because we have 183 people that we can't put many people on the screen and asking questions. Christine Madsen is the faculty director for the Berkeley Food Institute, and she's an associate professor at the Joint Medical Program and in Public Health Nutrition, Community Health Sciences at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health. Chris, welcome. In your chapter in Bite Back, which is called Fast Food Embodied, you write about the harm that the industrial diet, promoted by many sectors of our food system, has done to harm the well-being of people around the world. From your experiences as a physician and a food justice activist, what have you learned about challenging the industrial diet and the corporations that produce the industrial diet? And how can these lessons inform our responses to the COVID epidemic?
Thank you, Nick. And it's just so exciting and always energizing to hear my colleagues who are doing such amazing things. So one of the things, as a physician and in these crazy times and in the face of the COVID pandemic, one of the things that once again jumps out to me and is so striking is that those who are, we've lost 40,000 lives in the US from COVID so far. And those who have underlying illness, including illness that's related to diet, like diabetes and cardiovascular disease, are far more likely to die from COVID than people who are otherwise healthy, which is incredibly concerning, particularly because we know that diet-related disease is related to income. The richer you are, the more money you have at your disposal, the better your diet and the healthier you can be. So people who are working in the food system with all of this great food around them are often the least healthy and the least, have the least access to that food. So I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna talk you through just a couple of slides. So I started in practice. I'm trained as a pediatrician, and I worked at UCSF, our sister medical school, for many years before moving over to Berkeley. And both my research and clinical practice were focused on childhood obesity. And what I came to realize as I had been, doing this for a few years, was that it's not a medical problem in kids. So kids who are struggling with overweight, it's not a medical problem. It's true, I diagnosed some children teenagers with diabetes, but that was rare. Kids are very resilient. And the problem that I started wondering, why are new kids showing up in my clinic all the time? Because we were seeing youth who'd been referred by their own pediatricians. So why are they showing up in my clinic? And what's this system that keeps producing these kids who are going to be sick as they get older? And I realized I wasn't able to address what was creating these sick kids. I was just trying to sort of put, Band-Aids on a situation. And that what was really kind of creating this was the environment that a lot of these youth were exposed to. And I began to think, I need to move out of the clinic setting into a setting where I can address those upstream factors. And this is somebody created this graphic, but we are heavier right now than we've ever been as a nation. Just this year, the latest figures were published, and 40% of adults in the US actually have obesity. That's a historically high figure. And when we think about how did we get here, and what, from a public health perspective, just like we need to be more prepared for pandemics like COVID, we need to be implementing more preventive strategies to make sure we have a healthier population in general. And so I was thinking, what's created that? Well, one of the things that's created this is that we've used science to make some of the most amazingly tasty foods, and everything is really hyper palatable. These ultra processed foods, and we say ultra processed when we mean they've got basically ingredients that you wouldn't have at home and ingredients that you often can't pronounce. And we're feeding them, like 60% of our calories come from ultra processed foods. 60% of what we eat doesn't look anything like what it looked like when it was actually growing. And that's problematic because we know that that's actually causing a lot of our illness. And it's not just that it's, it tastes really good, it's that it's super cheap, that the portions are huge, like, 2 to 5 times larger than when I was growing up. And that some of them are actually addictive. There's a lot of emerging evidence on the addictive properties of sugar and soda in particular. And we've done some studies showing that youth who try to quit soda actually have a hard time getting off of it because they get headaches. They have signs of addiction, actually. They get, more cravings and they get headaches. And so if these are really hyper palatable, if they are cheap, if they're addictive, and if there's advertising everywhere, people, this is what's actually called a market failure, when everything is pushing people in a direction that's causing tremendous ill health. And we spend, the estimate is $400 billion a year in healthcare costs on diet-related disease, $300 billion on diabetes alone. So the market's failing us. And the way that public health, I think, needs to respond is we need to really think through how do we, since government's not able to step in against the food and beverage industry, how can we support the health of our people by sort of correcting for markets? Because right now it's making us incredibly sick. And this is just a graph showing the incredible rise in diabetes over the last 50 or 60 years. So when I reflect on other public health wins in the United States, things like eliminating smallpox and reducing polio, reducing cigarette smoking, the use of seatbelts and car seats, both of which have significantly reduced mortality associated with car crashes, motor vehicle accidents. If you look at these and you say, what have all of these major successes had in common? They all involved regulation of some kind. They actually involved people either going to the ballot and saying, this is what I care about, or people lobbying their legislators and saying, this is what we need to see changed. Because without universal vaccinations, without cigarette taxes, and without laws that mandate seatbelts and car seats, no one would have taken this up at the rates that they have been taken up in public. And this, for example, just looking at cigarette smoking, if we go from the 70s, there was a peak in the late 70s in the cigarette packs per person per year, which was, it peaked at like 140 packs, and is now down to only 41 packs per person per year, which is, as a public health person, higher than I'd like, but I'm so delighted to see this. One of the things that happened was that the taxes on those packs went up. So that's the federal tax per pack, but there are local taxes. Local cities can enact taxes if they want to, and so can states. So that's one example of a regulation. Front of package labeling is an incredible success. So when I think about solutions, and one of the things that both Saru and Andu definitely focused on was, what's the vision for change? Because if we want to move somewhere, we need to have a vision. And so one of the things that I've seen that I think is incredibly effective is front of package labeling. It's not easy to make this happen. Again, there's been incredible industry resistance, corporate resistance to it, but there are places across globally now that have labels on the front of packages that are really easy for consumers to understand, and some are mandatory and some are voluntary. A couple of examples. These are Chili has a mandatory front of package labeling. So on the package, anything that's got extra fat or salt or sugar actually has these big, bold symbols so that people know at a glance. If you're going to buy it, just be informed. Because in the absence of information from the public health side, all they've got coming at them is the advertising from industry. And then down here, we've got, this is in France. And what you'll notice is, what I really like about this is it's very clear, right? It's going from A to E, and it's going from green to red. Because sometimes what industry will do to soften the impact of things like front of package labeling is they'll actually try and do something like just put numbers on it without anybody knowing what those numbers mean. This is one of the things that happens on beef right now, because there are sustainable ways of producing beef and there are ways that are not so sustainable. And what the beef industry was able to do was just get a bunch of numbers up there. I don't know what a 1 means compared to a 4. So we need really clear labeling that's easy for consumers to understand. And these are some great examples. Another thing that we can do is advertising to children. So kids don't understand the difference between an ad and reality. And you probably have heard that, you know, more children recognize Ronald McDonald than Santa Claus. Chile was also able to ban advertising to children. And certainly we should ban advertising in schools. Much of it is gone. But there are still schools that have Channel 1 programming, which is closed circuit television it's sponsored by companies like Pepsi and McDonald's. And it provides 10 minutes of educational programming and 2 minutes of advertising. So that kind of thing is within our reach, and can be done with some organizing and effort on our part. And then the last thing I'm going to touch on is sugared beverages, sugary beverage taxes. This is just a quick picture of where we were at in terms of sugared beverage taxes worldwide. We have 7 right now locally in the United States. All of them are at a city level. And I want to point this out because when I think about COVID, I've been circling back to the work that we've done on sugary taxes, because I think that sugared beverage taxes not only are a way to drastically reduce consumption of something, of just pure sugar with no nutritional value, right? Soda, the one reason that we focused on soda is because it has no nutritional value at all. It's got nothing in it except sugar in water, basically flavored water. And the important thing about excise taxes, which is how all of the taxes right now, the sugar taxes in the US have been structured, is that they're actually levied on distributors. So distributors pay the tax, and there are 4 cities in California, as well as Philadelphia, Boulder, Colorado, and Seattle, Washington, that have taxes. And in all of them, the distributor pays the tax and it pays it to the city. The city can then decide how to use those monies, but because the distributor is paying the tax, they raise the price to the retailer because it costs them more to produce their product. And it should, because their product actually costs us money as a society, given that we have to pay, $400 billion a year to pay for diet-related disease. Retailers, in turn, raise the price for consumers, so the shelf price goes up. And as a result, consumers see a higher shelf price, and it does alter their behavior. And we have documented, there have been a number of studies now that have documented that people buy fewer sodas and consume fewer sugar-sweetened beverages in the face of taxes. And the city can invest those revenues in the community in whatever way the city chooses to do that. The revenues that have been used so far have largely gone into actually promoting infrastructure, parks and recs, and early childhood care, as well as gardening and nutrition classes in schools, and supporting local organizations that do diabetes prevention work. So all of this can lead to greater health equity. And one of the things that happened in Seattle and in San Francisco in the last month in response to COVID is that they took some of the revenues from those soda taxes and they actually gave them to families who were struggling because they'd lost their jobs due to COVID. So having something like a soda tax that can both improve the health of the public and give us some additional funding that we can use for emergency response is one incredibly exciting way that I can see to really try and both prevent, not only help us to prepare for something like a pandemic, but to have a healthier population should another when another pandemic occurs. And I'll stop there, Nick. I just wanted, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I just wanted to give some thoughts about how, from the public health side, I see promise, but realize we need people on the ground to organize with us and to lobby legislators to make these changes.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. Two announcements, and then I have a question for you. First, Rositza, can you turn on the chat? And the way we're going to handle this is that I will be able to see what you put on chat and direct the questions that you're posing to one of our three speakers. And we'll have about 20 minutes for that. And I also wanted to tell you that our June forum will focus on ultra-processed food. And we'll look at both some of the science and some of the interventions to reduce the consumption and the appeal of ultra-processed food. The question I have for you, Christine, is a question to you not as a physician or a policy analyst, but as a political activist. And the adverse impact of the highly processed food that you talk about falls on people with chronic conditions, as you mentioned, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension. It's complicating COVID, and it also has a big impact on our climate because of the way that these foods, the foods that are the core ingredient, the products that are the core ingredients, are actually grown and transported and processed. And I wonder if you could just talk for a minute or so about the political messages that could maybe bring together and mobilize a movement to implement some of the policy changes you summarized for us and others. What are the political messages that would bring people concerned about COVID, about chronic and non-communicable diseases, and about climate change together to act to constrain this harmful type of food?
Yeah, I think well, one of the things that we need a healthy population, right? We need a population that can withstand all sorts of the turbulence that's about to come up, and we also need a resilient food system. So we need a resilient population and a resilient food system. And when we think about the resiliency of the food system, climate change, you know, the pandemic, this is just the beginning of our sort of tumultuous next 100 years, with climate change just around the corner. And so when we think about what do we need to work with our legislators on, it's building in resiliency in the food system, resiliency in the health system. So I think that's my focus, because there are so many different messages, and this is true, you know, what Andy was talking about and what Jose was talking about as well, that we can't think of things as being siloed. And so the message to the legislators, let's look at the food system as a whole, and how do you build resiliency throughout that food system, all the way from the you know, the labor and the farm up to the fork and beyond.
Great, thanks. And we're starting to have questions pouring in, and I'm going to suggest a direction to one of the speakers. And if I can ask the speakers to be brief in their response to a question so that we can engage a lot of people. The first question from Nadine that I'm going to direct to you, Christine, is what's the role of dietitians, nutritionists, clinicians in these fights that we're talking about? Some of the therapies might not be as accessible to people with lower income. How do you think clinicians of various disciplines can open this up?
Right. Well, clinicians should start looking into food as medicine. We know that prescribing food to people who've just been, you know, prescribing healthier food to people who have been released from the hospital is showing great promise in reducing rehospitalizations. For both clinicians and dietitians, I would argue, think about where the food is coming from. So trying not to be siloed and staying within your realm, but thinking about where you exist within the food system, because you can counsel your patients to eat not just for their own health, but for the health of the planet.
Great. A second question from Leslie. Saru talked about the slogan and coalition, "There is no going back." And Jose, I wonder, We were in a call the other day where people talked about articulating a vision for a food system. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the opportunities for people who want to connect to some of these newly emerging national coalitions, both around COVID, around food worker justice.
Absolutely. So I do think that the vision that's emerging, I sort of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but the vision that's emerging is using the crisis of unemployment as a way of actually getting those folks employed in the new food system, that food system that we want to see. And that's not enough, right? That we simultaneous to that have to also fight against these large corporations who are essentially trying to ransack the public coffers in order to, as Andy very well put it, and I think it was somebody else's quote, right? But the crisis creates a vacuum, and whoever is best positioned to fill the vacuum will have power after the crisis is over, and that's exactly what these corporations are trying to do. The coalitions that are emerging are really exciting because they're both at the local level. In places like here in Chicago, there's a coalition that's called the Earth Day to May Day Coalition, and that's really bringing together everything from food justice, public health folks, a lot of labor, obviously labor and environmental groups are kind of the core of that coalition. And then there's larger national configurations. HEAL obviously is pretty well positioned to be sort of in the center of a lot of what these coalitions are trying to do. And I think it's fair to say that there's a consensus that it isn't an either or moment, that this is an and both moment, that we have to both create that food system that we want to see while we're dismantling the old food system that is creating illness and despair for a lot of folks all over the world.
Great, thanks. Several of you are asking, are we going to post the YouTube? And yes, it should be up within the next 24 to 36 hours. And we will also put a set of resources, both some of the materials that our presenters presented and any organizations or publications they recommend, including how you can find out more about this book. Miranda asked a question, and I'm going to start with an answer, but ask any of our speakers who might want to add to this. She asked, what are some ways we can reduce meat consumption to build healthier, resilient communities, given that meat consumption is at the center of our unhealthy food system? And I just wanted to share an anecdote about some ways not to do it. I read that just this week, Kentucky Fried Chicken, one of the affiliates of Yum Brands, a global fast food company, started selling plant-based fried chicken nuggets in China. And I think for those of us who have a critique of ultra-processed food, the solution to unhealthy animal foods is not to produce ultra-processed plant-based products, because the science suggests, as we'll talk about in June, that it is the multitude of ingredients and not only the meat and the fat that is an ultra-processed food. So replacing chicken with plant-based processed food isn't the solution. And so we really need to think through what are sustainable, health-supporting, and what are the implications for the substitutes for meat, for farmers, and also for people who work on farms and work in processing plants. And I wonder if any of our speakers want to add something about that question of reducing meat consumption.
I would just, just really quickly, I'll say, one, for entrepreneurs, I think that it is a huge opportunity to come up with legume-based and plant-based alternatives, ideally healthy, not ultra-processed alternatives, and also incentivizing. So beef has a huge footprint. It's the biggest climate food, of our entire system. Beef has the biggest climate footprint. And if we just talk about trying to be fossil fuel free and carbon neutral, we'll have to incentivize different ways of raising cattle, which will automatically increase the price and would actually reduce consumption.
And if I can add something in here, I mean, I've been a vegetarian for 35 years, but it's weird for me coming out for meat in any way. But there's a whole arena around regenerative agriculture and grass-based grazing, grass-based meat, grass-fed meat that is, potentially more sustainable, a lot more sustainable than CAFO meat, and potentially even regenerative and positive in some landscapes. But part of the problem around this issue that leads to CAFOs and supports CAFOs is that there's a lack of USDA-approved livestock facilities, slaughter facilities in many communities. That infrastructure has gone by the wayside in many places. So it's very difficult for entrepreneurs, for small farmers to have that kind of grass-fed grazing, regenerative practices in many parts of the country, because there's no place to take their animals, and where there is, it's very expensive to transport them. So bringing that infrastructure back, ironically, will not necessarily reduce the meat consumption, but will increase better meat consumption.
And we've also seen the really horrific conditions in some of the meat processing plants, something also that cries out for attention. Natalie has a question.
One quick thing.
Yes, go ahead.
If you don't mind me jumping in really quick on the meat question. I think this is an example of why we need to think holistically. Right? Because I think in pork, pork is about 60% union. The average wages there are about $18 an hour, and in beef, it's 80% union. Average wages are over $20 an hour. And so when we're talking about getting rid of those sectors, the workers who fought very hard to have those benefits and those wages feel directly attacked, right? They feel like you're talking about them and getting rid of their jobs, which are good jobs. If we have an alternative, right, that is also a well-paying union alternative, that's a different proposition, right? It's a question of a just transition to that other sector rather than just getting rid of the jobs that have been fought for so long and so hard.
Thank you, Jose. Really important point. Natalie has a question directed at Christine. Some people say that soda taxes and tobacco taxes are regressive and impose a bigger burden on low-income people. What do you think of that argument?
I think it's true that certainly if you are low income, you spend a higher proportion of your income on food. We know that. It's a much bigger penalty in that sense. However, if you look at where disease sits, disease is incredibly regressive because the advertising from the food industrial complex is aimed at people who often aimed at low income neighborhoods. There's very pervasive in low income neighborhoods. And so if we're going to try and attack that disease, we need multifaceted approaches. But I appreciate that argument.
The next question from Lizette, and maybe Jose, you could start on this. How can both governments and organizers better protect undocumented folks, both on the work side and the community and consumer side, against the combination of the assault from COVID and the assault from federal immigrant policies, which are coming out fast, furious, and crazy from Washington these days?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, whoever asked that question. So I think everything is going to be state level and local level responses at this point. We don't expect there to be any federal support for undocumented workers. I think the equalizing labor, employment, and health and safety laws so that everyone who works is covered by those laws. Even though there's an assumption that that's the case, there has been, since Trump has been in the White House, there's been this sort of assumption that those laws are going to apply differently to folks who are documented versus those who are undocumented. And so I think the best approach is what California has done, what Illinois is trying to do right now, what I think the state of New York is also on track to doing, which is to doing some equalizing of those labor laws, right? So farm workers, for instance, who are almost 70% undocumented, are not covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act. They're not covered in the National Labor Relations Act. And if we get rid of those exceptions, then what we're doing is we're extending protections that have for so long sort of excluded undocumented workers just by the mere fact that they work in those industries.
Great, thanks. And the last question, and then after we get a few quick answers to it, I will ask each of you to just take a minute for any closing thoughts. This question is from Mary. Are there any ways to work with corporations? And are there ways to enlist them in supporting our goals? And maybe I'll get started on that. And I think it's not a moral position that we should be talking or engaging with corporations or not. It's a practical question. And to what extent will such conversations and such alliances leave people, as Saru said earlier, actually in better condition, with more food, better working conditions, and so on. And it's that empirical test that I think we need to put to it. My feeling is that activists can sit down with corporations, but we're in an asymmetrical power relationship. And if we want to invite them to our table, we might need to ask for some commitments that they will stop undermining democracy if they want to engage with us, that they will stop predatory marketing of unhealthy products. And if they're willing to come to the table with some concessions about following business as usual, where profit comes before people, then I think it makes a lot of sense to sit down and talk. But if they expect us to come and have the discussion that it's going to be business as usual, where they get to decide what they produce, how much they charge for it, how they promote it, then I think it's not a very productive conversation to have. Other thoughts on that, and then closing statements?
I think that was well said, Nick. I think that's, and I do worry in these times of incredibly divisive conversation and discourse that not painting any person as a demon. And I think, our students in particular need to understand that people are born entrepreneurs. People like thinking about how to create new things, but it needs to be done within a framework that again protects people and the planet.
Good. Jose, do you want to start with just some final thoughts for the many people who've listened to us so attentively?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Nick, and thanks to Andy and Chris and Saru, even though she's not she's not here. This really was a lot of fun, and definitely learned a lot from all of you. I think the key takeaway, or the key thing that I want to leave you all with, is the thought around holistic procurement. And when I say holistic, what I mean is really thinking about all of these sectors, right? Health and agriculture, both urban and rural, environmental impact, both on the production end and on the waste end of food, and of course labor, right? And that all of those sectors together, if we have procurement tools similar to the Good Food Purchasing Policy, that could actually use large institutional purchasing to leverage better buying practices that include all of those value categories, that we can achieve a lot more, right? And that could be done through organizing, through pushing local and state and even federal government to pass laws that mandate for those value categories to be part of what our food system ought to look like. And if we don't organize and we don't have power to do that, I think it's exactly what you said, right? It's an unequitable conversation. There's no way that we're going to have the power to be able to ask or demand that those procurement policies be put in place. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you for inviting me again.
Great. Andy?
If you're going to say something similar, appreciate that. A couple things. I mean, first, we all obviously need to mobilize around the November election to reclaim our democracy. And we see, you know, from a charitable perspective and from, you know, from my conversation, my talk, that the Trump administration is very invested in food banks because they don't question where the food comes from, and they're grateful for, well, they're basically solving Trump's problems for him on a number of different levels. So we need to move to reclaim the White House away from Trump. From a different perspective, I mean, I think what we also need to be doing is pushing the food banking community not just to be distributing food. Obviously there's a huge demand and they're all running in crisis mode, but they can be doing organizing as well. They can be stuffing voter registration forms into the food bags that they're putting out. They can be handing pamphlets out to encourage this incredible number of people. You know, there used to be 40 million people that they're serving. They're now serving 50, 60, 80 million people. They need to be organizing those folks towards political action, contacting their congressmen about policy change to support SNAP, to bring back for universal health care, for other programs that are going to stop us from being in this situation in the first place. So we need to help social service agencies also be agents of social change as well. And that's incumbent on all of us to push them in that direction.
Thank you. And Christine, closing thoughts?
I would just say, I think that I draw such inspiration from the younger generations who are going to be dealing with, you know, a lot of the things that we've neglected over time. But I get so inspired because I think they do have a vision. And returning to that idea of a vision, you know, it can feel overwhelming. And I think sometimes we're paralyzed with all the things that need to happen. And I realize it's a huge shift that has to happen for us. As you know, we can't go back to things the way that they were. But talking to young people and doing small things like Plastic-Free July, whatever those small things are that you can do locally that contribute to that vision, I think they help us all get in the game and stay in the game.
Great, thanks. And thank you so much to our 4 speakers who really gave us a wonderful overview of opportunities for food activism. Thanks to Rositza Oliva and Craig Willingham. Rositza is our Director of Food Policy, Craig our Deputy Director, and they played a key role in organizing this and making it happen. And also, I just wanted to thank all of you, especially in this time, to both join this, to take a step back, and want to encourage you to stay well, stay safe, protect yourself, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you all. Have a good day.